Walter and Evelyn Mercer, an elderly couple whose peaceful life is destroyed by loss, betrayal, and loneliness. After losing his wife of 43 years and the home they built together, Walter is left completely alone with almost nothing. If you want to know what happened next, keep watching this story and also subscribe our channel to get stories like this. Walter and Evelyn Mercer had lived in the same little blue house for 43 years, long enough for the wooden porch to remember the sound of their footsteps, and the kitchen walls to carry the scent of cinnamon and coffee even after midnight. The house stood at the end of a quiet road, where maple trees leaned over the sidewalks like old friends sharing secrets. In autumn, leaves gathered in soft amber piles across their lawn, and every Saturday morning Walter swept them carefully while Evelyn stood by the window with a warm mug in her hands, pretending she was supervising him when really she simply loved watching him move through the world. Walter was 68, tall but thinner now than he used to be, with silver hair that curled slightly above his ears, and hands rough from decades repairing clocks and watches in the tiny shop he once owned downtown. Evelyn was 65, gentle in a way that made strangers lower their voices around her without even realizing it. She wore soft cardigans the color of lavender and cream, and she hummed while doing almost everything. Sometimes she hummed while folding laundry, sometimes while watering the roses, sometimes while sleeping beside him. They had no great wealth, no grand adventures to brag about, no photographs from expensive vacations hanging on their walls, but there was love in every corner of that house, love in the faded quilt Evelyn's mother had sewn by hand, love in the crack on the dining table Walter had accidentally made years ago while building a bookshelf. Love in the tiny pencil marks inside the pantry door where they once measured the height of the son they no longer spoke to very often. Their mornings always began the same way. Walter woke first, always first. He would shuffle into the kitchen in his slippers while the sky was still pale and uncertain, grind fresh coffee beans, and open the curtains slowly so the morning light would not disturb Evelyn too harshly. Then he would stand at the stove making eggs while listening to the old radio balanced near the sink. Evelyn usually appeared a few minutes later, wrapped in her robe, smiling before she even fully opened her eyes. "You burned the toast again," she would say softly. "And yet you keep staying," Walter always answered. She laughed every single time. It is strange how happiness often looks ordinary when you are standing inside it. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch swing. Walter read old mystery novels while Evelyn knitted scarves no one asked for. Sometimes rain tapped gently against the roof while thunder rolled far away like a tired old drum. Sometimes children rode bicycles past the house and waved. Life moved slowly there, peacefully. Walter loved Sundays most of all. Every Sunday morning, Evelyn opened the windows no matter the weather. Even in winter, she insisted fresh air carried blessings into a home. Walter used to tease her about it while pretending to shiver dramatically beneath his sweater. "You're trying to freeze us to death." "No," she would laugh softly while sunlight touched her silver hair. "I'm trying to remind the house it's alive." Then she would place old jazz records onto the turntable near the bookshelf, and music drifted gently through every room like warm smoke. Walter usually cooked breakfast while she watered plants lined carefully along the kitchen windowsill. Tiny green leaves stretched toward the morning light as though they trusted her completely. Sometimes neighbors stopped by unexpectedly just to sit with them for coffee. There was something comforting about the Mercer house. The smell of cinnamon always lingered there. So did kindness. Children from the neighborhood often waved at Evelyn because she remembered every birthday and every lost tooth, and every small sadness in their lives. She kept handwritten cards in a wooden drawer for nearly every occasion imaginable. Walter once asked her why she spent so much time doing things people rarely thanked her for. Evelyn smiled while sealing an envelope. "Because lonely people remember kindness forever." Walter never forgot that sentence. On quiet evenings, they sometimes looked through old photo albums together, not because they feared aging, but because they loved remembering ordinary moments nobody else would care about. A blurry photograph of Daniel holding a frog, Evelyn burning Thanksgiving pie one year and laughing until tears rolled down her face, Walter asleep in a lawn chair with gardening gloves still on his hands. Their life had not been perfect. There were years of financial stress, arguments spoken too sharply, long periods when exhaustion replaced romance. But they always returned to each other somehow. Always. And maybe that is what love truly becomes after 40 years together. Not fireworks, not poetry, a place to rest your soul. And perhaps that was why neither of them noticed how fragile everything truly was. The first sign came on a cold November evening. Evelyn dropped a glass while washing dishes. Walter looked up from his chair. "You all right?" She smiled too quickly. "Just clumsy." But later that night, he noticed her rubbing her chest when she thought he was asleep. A week passed, then another. She grew quieter somehow, not sad exactly, just distant in tiny moments. Once she forgot the name of a neighbor she had known for 20 years. Another time she sat down halfway up the stairs because she suddenly felt dizzy. Walter suggested seeing a doctor. "I'm just getting old," she whispered. "You've been getting old for 40 years, he replied. "This feels different." The rain outside their bedroom window sounded heavier that night, and somewhere deep beneath the comfort of their familiar life, something had already begun to break. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and fear. Walter hated hospitals. He hated the endless white hallways and the way people tried to smile too much. He hated the vending machines humming in waiting rooms where exhausted families sat staring at the floor. Most of all, he hated the silence that sometimes followed a doctor entering the room. The doctor who spoke to them was young enough to be their grandson. He explained things carefully, too carefully. Heart failure, complications, surgery risks, words that floated through the room like cold smoke. Evelyn listened quietly while Walter kept nodding as though understanding could somehow protect them. "How long?" Walter finally asked. The doctor paused. That pause told him everything. Afterward, they drove home in silence. Rain blurred the windshield. Walter gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Evelyn reached over and touched his hand. "Don't look like that," she said gently. "Like what?" "Like the world just ended." He swallowed hard. "Didn't it?" She turned toward the window after that. Over the next months, their little house changed. Medicine bottles appeared beside the coffee maker. Doctor appointments replaced evening walks. Evelyn slept more often. Sometimes Walter woke in the middle of the night just to make sure her chest was still rising. He became frightened of silence. One afternoon, he found her sitting on the porch swing, staring at the maple trees. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "I was trying to remember the sound our son made when he laughed as a child." Walter sat beside her. "Did you remember?" "A little." Their son Daniel lived 3 states away now. Successful, busy, important. Calls became shorter every year, visits rare. Life had pulled him elsewhere long ago, though neither Walter nor Evelyn ever said it out loud. When they finally told him about Evelyn's illness over the phone, there was a long silence. "I'll try to come soon," Daniel said. But weeks passed, then months. No visit came. Winter settled heavily over the town. Snow covered the porch rails in soft white layers. Inside the house, Walter wrapped blankets around Evelyn's legs while pretending not to notice how thin she had become. One night, she asked him to dance. "There's no music," he whispered. "There's always music somewhere." So he held her carefully in the middle of their kitchen while snow drifted outside the windows and the old refrigerator hummed quietly beside them. They moved slowly, gently, like 2 people trying not to wake a sleeping world. Evelyn rested her head against his chest. promise me something," she murmured. "Anything? When I go, don't disappear with me." Walter closed his eyes. "Don't talk like that. You need to promise." He could not answer, because some promises are impossible for the human heart to make. Evelyn died 3 days later, just before dawn. If you like this story, press like button. This helps to reach our stories to more people like you. The days after her death blurred together strangely. Walter barely remembered who visited the house or what people said to him. He only remembered sounds. The sound of chairs moving quietly during the funeral gathering. The sound of neighbors washing dishes in the kitchen. The sound of Daniel crying softly behind the garage where he thought nobody could hear him. But the hardest sound of all was the silence inside their bedroom at night. Walter could not sleep on his side of the bed anymore. He kept reaching across the mattress, expecting warmth that never came. Once, half awake, he whispered Evelyn's name naturally as breathing. The silence afterward felt unbearable. A week later, Walter discovered one of her handwritten grocery lists folded inside a cookbook. Milk, tea, bread, Walter's favorite soup. He stared at those words for nearly 10 minutes because suddenly they felt more valuable than anything he owned. Proof she had existed. Proof she had loved him in 1,000 invisible ways every single day. Grief does strange things to memory. Small details become enormous. Walter could no longer remember certain conversations clearly, yet he remembered exactly how Evelyn tucked her cold feet beneath his legs every winter night. One afternoon, he walked into a pharmacy and instinctively reached for her medication before realizing she no longer needed it. He stood frozen in the aisle while strangers walked around him impatiently. That was the moment grief stopped feeling dramatic and started feeling permanent. Walter had fallen asleep in the chair beside her bed. When he woke, the room felt different somehow. Still, he reached for her hand. Cold. Outside, birds were beginning to sing. And that was the cruelest part of grief, perhaps. The world continued. Morning still arrived, coffee still brewed, cars still passed outside. Somewhere, people laughed. But Walter sat there holding her hand while his entire universe quietly collapsed into silence. The funeral was small. Daniel came wearing an expensive black coat and checking his phone too often. He hugged his father awkwardly at the cemetery. "You should think about selling the house," he said later that evening while standing in the kitchen. "It's too much for you alone." Walter stared at him. "This house is your mother." Daniel sighed tiredly. "Dad, that doesn't even make sense." Maybe it didn't, but grief rarely speaks logically. After the funeral, the days became shapeless. Walter stopped opening the curtains in the mornings. He stopped shaving regularly. Sometimes he sat in Evelyn's favorite chair for hours without moving, listening to the old clock tick across the room. The silence inside the house felt unbearable now. Every object reminded him of her. Her knitting basket near the fireplace, her reading glasses on the nightstand, the tiny crack in her favorite mug. One evening, he accidentally made 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. When he realized it, he stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the extra cup until tears finally came hard and uncontrollable. Grief at his age was different than grief in youth. Young people still expect life to give something back. Old people know better. Then came the second loss. 3 months after Evelyn's death, Walter received a notice from the bank. Daniel had convinced them years earlier to refinance the house during difficult financial times. Walter barely understood the paperwork back then. He trusted his son completely. Now he discovered Daniel had secretly borrowed heavily against the property for a failed business investment. The debt was enormous. Impossible. Walter called him immediately. "There has to be some mistake." Daniel sounded exhausted, defensive. "I meant to fix it before you found out. You used our house?" "I was trying to save my company." Walter sat down slowly at the kitchen table. This was your mother's home. I know. No, Walter whispered. You don't. The foreclosure process moved quickly after that. Too quickly. Walter sold furniture first, then Evelyn's jewelry, then his old watch repair tools. Still, it wasn't enough. On the final morning before he had to leave, he walked slowly through every room carrying a cardboard box filled with photographs and clothes. Dust floated through sunlight streaming from the windows. The house felt strangely empty already, as if it knew he was leaving. In the bedroom, he found one of Evelyn's cardigans hanging behind the door. He pressed it against his face. It still smelled faintly like lavender. That nearly destroyed him. You might wonder how someone survives losing both the love of their life and the only home they have ever known. The truth is, sometimes they barely do. Walter rented a tiny room above an old grocery store across town. The wallpaper peeled near the ceiling. Pipes rattled at night. The mattress hurt his back. But worst of all, nothing there belonged to Evelyn. He ate canned soup standing at the sink because there was no table. He counted coins before buying bread. Once he spent nearly 10 minutes deciding whether he could afford fresh apples. The loneliness became physical somehow, like carrying stones inside his chest. Sometimes Walter rode the bus for no reason at all, just to avoid sitting alone inside the apartment. He watched strangers carefully during those rides. Young couples arguing quietly, teenagers laughing too loudly, mothers carrying sleeping babies against their shoulders. Life continued everywhere around him. He felt invisible inside it. One rainy afternoon, he entered a small diner simply because the smell of coffee reminded him of Evelyn. A waitress near the counter asked kindly, "Table for one?" Walter nearly answered, "No, two." The word stopped painfully inside his throat. He sat near the window instead, stirring cold coffee for almost an hour while listening to dishes clatter around him. Across the room, an elderly woman laughed at something her husband whispered into her ear. Walter looked away immediately, not from jealousy, from memory. When he returned home that night, he opened a cardboard box filled with Evelyn's old scarves. He buried his face against the fabric and inhaled deeply, desperately trying to hold on to the fading scent of her perfume. But time was stealing even that from him now, and nothing frightened him more. At night, he spoke aloud sometimes, just to hear a human voice. "I saw the first roses blooming today," he whispered once into the darkness. No answer came. Winter returned. His hands shook more now. Arthritis, age, sadness, perhaps all three. One freezing evening, he sat in a laundromat waiting for his clothes to dry. Around him, machines spun endlessly while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A young mother folded tiny shirts nearby while her little girl laughed about something only children understand. Walter watched them quietly. Then he looked down at the single-dollar bill in his hand, and for the first time in his life he wondered whether there was any point continuing. The thought frightened him, not because he wanted to die exactly, but because he no longer knew why he was alive. That night he walked home slowly through falling snow. Streetlights glowed pale gold against the darkness. His shoes were wet, his fingers numb. Halfway up the stairs to his apartment, he stopped. Everything suddenly felt unbearably heavy. The grief, the loneliness, the shame. He sat on the cold stairwell and lowered his head into his hands. "I'm tired, Evelyn," he whispered. For a long moment he remained there listening to the distant sounds of traffic and wind rattling old windows. Then something unexpected happened. A soft voice behind him said, "Sir, are you all right?" Walter turned slowly. A little girl stood near the bottom of the stairs, holding a paper bag of groceries. She could not have been older than 10. Dark curls framed her face beneath a wool hat too large for her head. He wiped quickly at his eyes. "I'm fine." She stared at him with the blunt honesty children possess. "You don't look fine." Walter almost smiled. The girl climbed halfway up the stairs and held out the bag. "My mother made extra soup," she said. "She said old people forget to eat sometimes." Before he could answer, she hurried away. Inside the bag was a container of warm chicken soup and 2 slices of homemade bread wrapped carefully in cloth. Walter sat alone in his tiny apartment, holding the warm container in trembling hands. And somehow, for the first time in months, he cried for a reason other than pain. The girl's name was Sophia. She lived downstairs with her mother, Elena, who worked nights cleaning offices downtown. Over the following weeks, Sophia began knocking occasionally on Walter's door. Sometimes she brought soup, sometimes questions. Did dinosaurs really exist? Why do old clocks tick louder at night? Do lonely people dream differently? Walter found himself answering, talking, even laughing once or twice. One afternoon, Sophia noticed the small broken watch lying on his windowsill. "You can fix that? I used to fix hundreds," Walter said. Her eyes widened. "Can you teach me?" He hesitated, then nodded. That single decision changed everything. Every Saturday afterward, Sophia sat beside him at the tiny kitchen counter while Walter showed her how gears moved together inside watches like tiny beating hearts. Her small fingers struggled with the delicate tools, but she never gave up. The first watch Sophia repaired successfully was small and silver with a cracked leather strap. She spent nearly 4 hours concentrating so intensely that her tongue poked slightly from the corner of her mouth. Walter pretended not to notice. When the watch finally began ticking again, Sophia gasped loudly, "I fixed it!" Walter smiled wider than he had in years. "Yes," he whispered, "you did." Sophia held the watch carefully against her ear, listening to the tiny heartbeat inside it. "It sounds alive." "That's because time is alive," Walter said softly. "Most people just move too fast to hear it." After that day, word slowly spread around the neighborhood about the old watchmaker upstairs. People began bringing broken clocks, watches, and music boxes to him again. Not because they could not buy new ones, because Walter repaired things with care. There is a difference. Sometimes customers stayed longer than necessary just to talk. An old widower whose daughter never visited, a retired teacher struggling with memory loss, a woman who cried quietly while Walter repaired the watch her late husband once wore. Without realizing it, Walter had begun rebuilding more than watches. He was rebuilding people. "You're patient," Walter told her once. "You're lonely," she answered matter-of-factly. Children often see truths adults hide from each other. Months pass. Slowly, almost invisibly, life began returning to Walter in small pieces. He started shaving again, opening curtains, buying fresh bread instead of canned soup. Then one rainy afternoon, Sophia arrived carrying an old wooden box. "My mother found this at a flea market," she said breathlessly. "She thought you might like it." Walter opened the box carefully. Inside lay dozens of damaged pocket watches tangled together beneath faded velvet cloth. But one watch made his breath catch instantly. Gold casing, tiny carved initials, E.M. Evelyn Mercer. His hands trembled violently. "No," he whispered. "It could not be." Years ago, shortly after they married, Walter had given Evelyn a gold pocket watch inherited from his grandfather. She adored it, carried it everywhere. But during a difficult financial season decades earlier, they had sold it quietly to pay medical bills after Daniel broke his arm. Evelyn cried for hours afterward. Walter lifted the watch carefully and noticed something strange. The back panel looked thicker than he remembered. With trembling fingers, he pressed the tiny hidden latch beneath the hinge. A secret compartment opened. Inside rested several folded letters yellowed with age. Walter stared in disbelief. The first envelope carried Evelyn's handwriting. "For Walter." only when the time is right. His heart pounded. He unfolded the letter slowly. My darling Walter, if you are reading this, then life has taken us somewhere difficult again. I wish I could sit beside you while you open this, because you always looked so serious when reading letters. There is something I never told you. 40 years ago, before Daniel was born, I inherited land from my uncle Elias. I kept the documents hidden because at the time we were struggling badly, and I was afraid people would pressure us to sell it quickly. Then life became busy. Years passed. I forgot where I placed the papers until recently. The land is near a lake far north of here. Most likely worthless, but perhaps not. The papers are enclosed, and Walter, if I am gone when you find this, promise me one thing. Live, not just survive. Live. Walter's vision blurred with tears. Inside the compartment were old legal documents proving ownership of several acres of undeveloped lakeside land. He stared at the papers for a long time, then laughed softly through tears. Evelyn, he whispered, what have you done? At first he assumed the land held little value, remote property, untouched for decades. Still, curiosity pushed him to visit. The trip took nearly 2 days by bus. When Walter finally arrived, cold wind swept across the lake while pine trees swayed under gray skies. The property itself looked wild and forgotten. Tall grass, fallen branches, silence. But there was something beautiful there too, peaceful. Near the shoreline stood an abandoned cabin half hidden beneath vines. Walter stepped carefully inside. Dust coated everything. Yet on one wall he noticed strange sketches pinned beneath cracked glass. Drawings of watches, hundreds of them. Complex designs unlike anything he had ever seen. An elderly man from a nearby town later explained the mystery. The cabin once belonged to a brilliant watchmaker named Elias Mercer, Evelyn's uncle. Years before his death, collectors traveled from everywhere hoping to buy his handcrafted timepieces. Some called him a genius. He hid his finest work somewhere before he died, the old man said. People searched for years. Walter's pulse quickened. Back at the cabin, he examined the sketches more carefully. One drawing contained a sequence of symbols carved into the frame. Something about them felt familiar. Then he realized why. They matched the carvings inside Evelyn's pocket watch. His hands shook as understanding slowly formed. The watch was not merely sentimental. It was a key. For hours, Walter searched the cabin. Behind loose boards, beneath floor panels, inside cabinets swollen from age, nothing. Evening approached. Rain began tapping softly against the roof. Exhausted, Walter sat heavily beside the fireplace, staring at Evelyn's watch. You always loved mysteries, he murmured. Almost absent-mindedly, he wound the watch. Click! A faint sound echoed behind the stone fireplace wall. Walter froze. Slowly he approached the fireplace and pressed carefully against the stones until one shifted inward. Behind it rested a hidden compartment. Inside lay 6 exquisite handcrafted watches wrapped in velvet cloth alongside journals filled with Elias's designs and notes. Walter lifted one carefully. It was breathtaking. Tiny moving constellations spun beneath crystal glass, while golden hands glided silently across the face. Even after decades repairing watches, Walter had never seen craftsmanship like this. His breath caught. And that, perhaps, was the moment everything changed. Experts later confirmed the truth. The hidden watches were worth a fortune. Collectors across the country had spent years searching for Elias Mercer's lost creations. The journals alone contained designs museums wanted to preserve. Walter should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt terrified. The attention overwhelmed him immediately. Lawyers, buyers, reporters, auction houses calling nonstop. It's life-changing money, one appraiser told him. Walter sat stiffly in the office chair, gripping his hat nervously. There must be some mistake. There isn't. Back home, Daniel suddenly began calling again, frequently. You deserve this, Dad, he said over the phone with forced warmth. Maybe I can help manage things. Walter closed his eyes. For the first time in his life, he heard dishonesty clearly in his son's voice. I need time, Walter answered quietly. At night, doubt consumed him. What if he mishandled everything? What if people cheated him? What if he failed Evelyn somehow? He almost refused the auction entirely. One evening, Sophia found him sitting alone, staring at the documents spread across his table. You look scared. I am scared. Why? Walter sighed heavily. Because everything is changing. Sophia considered this seriously. My mother says people only find out who they are when life changes. Walter smiled faintly. Your mother is wise. No, Sophia replied. She's just tired all the time. A week later, Elena visited Walter upstairs after finishing work. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes. Sophia says you might sell the watches. Maybe you should. Walter looked uncertain. I don't know if I deserve any of this. Elena frowned gently. Why would you say that? Because good things stopped happening a long time ago. She sat quietly for a moment before speaking. My husband left when Sophia was 3. Some nights I worked 3 jobs just to keep heat in our apartment. I used to believe life only took things away from people like us. She looked directly at him. But sometimes life returns something too, not always what we lost, sometimes something different. Walter stared down at his hands. I'm afraid if I hope for too much, it will disappear again. Elena's voice softened. Hope is not the dangerous thing. Giving up is. Those words stayed with him. The auction was scheduled for spring. In the weeks leading up to it, Walter struggled constantly between fear and possibility. Some mornings he convinced himself to proceed. Other mornings he nearly canceled everything. Then came the final obstacle. A legal dispute emerged over ownership claims from distant relatives of Elias Mercer. Lawyers warned the case could drag on for years. Daniel called immediately. You need aggressive representation, he insisted. Let me handle it. Walter stood by his tiny apartment window watching rain slide down the glass. No, Dad, no more handling things for me. Silence filled the line. Then Daniel spoke quietly. You still blame me. Walter's voice broke slightly. Your mother died believing this family would always protect each other. Daniel inhaled shakily. I never meant to hurt you. I know, Walter whispered, but you did. For several days afterward, Walter barely slept. Then, unexpectedly, he received another letter. One final letter hidden inside Elias's journal, written by Evelyn years earlier. Walter, if trouble comes, remember something important. You spent your whole life repairing broken things with your hands. Watches, clocks, even people sometimes. You have always believed value comes from what can be measured. Money, time, possessions. But the greatest thing about you was never what you earned. It was how gently you carried the people you loved. Do not become afraid of your own future now. She knew him so well it almost hurt. The court eventually ruled fully in Walter's favor. The watches belonged legally to Evelyn's estate. The auction proceeded. Collectors traveled from everywhere to attend. Cameras flashed constantly. Walter felt painfully out of place in his old brown suit while wealthy bidders examined the watches beneath bright lights. When the final bid closed, the room erupted into applause. Walter barely heard it, because all he could think about was Evelyn dancing with him in their kitchen while snow fell softly outside. The money changed his life overnight, but not in the way people expected. Walter did not buy expensive cars or travel the world. he did something far stranger. He bought back the blue house at the end of the maple-lined street. The porch needed repairs. Paint peeled near the windows. But when he stepped inside again, emotion hit him so suddenly he had to steady himself against the wall. It still smelled faintly like cinnamon and coffee. Neighbors cried when he returned. Even Daniel came to visit one afternoon carrying visible shame in his eyes. "I don't expect forgiveness," he admitted quietly. Walter studied his son for a long moment. Age had touched Daniel too now, gray at the temples, tiredness behind the eyes. "Sit down," Walter finally said. It was not complete healing, but it was a beginning. Walter transformed the old watch shop downtown into something new, a small workshop where elderly people repaired clocks, taught crafts, painted, and shared meals together. Many had lost spouses, homes, purpose, just like he once had. Sophia became his first student. By 13, she could repair delicate watch mechanisms better than most professionals. "You have magic hands," Walter told her proudly one afternoon. "No," she laughed, "you taught me." The workshop slowly became filled with warmth and noise and life. Coffee brewing, tools clicking softly, old people laughing louder than they had in years. Walter often stood quietly in the corner, watching them all with tears threatening his eyes, because loneliness had nearly convinced him his story was over. But it wasn't. One summer evening, he sat again on the restored porch swing outside the blue house. Fireflies drifted across the yard, while distant thunder rolled softly through the hills. The workshop became busiest during winter. Snow gathered softly along the windows, while laughter and conversation filled the warm little building downtown. Some afternoons, Walter simply stood near the doorway, watching elderly strangers drink coffee together like lifelong friends. Many of them arrived carrying grief, but fewer carried it alone when they left. Daniel started visiting more often, too. At first, the conversations remained awkward and careful, like two men crossing thin ice, but healing rarely arrives dramatically. Usually it comes quietly through ordinary moments. One afternoon, Daniel helped Walter repaint shelves inside the workshop. "You know," Daniel said while wiping paint from his hands, "Mom used to tell me I got my stubbornness from you." Walter chuckled softly. She was right. Daniel grew quiet afterward. "I'm sorry," he finally whispered. Walter looked at his son for a long moment, really looked at him, not as the man who made terrible mistakes, but as the frightened boy who once ran through maple leaves outside the blue house. Grief had wounded them differently, but it had wounded them both. Walter placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "We still have time," he said. And sometimes those 4 words can save an entire family. Beside him rested Evelyn's pocket watch, still ticking, always ticking. Walter leaned back and closed his eyes as warm wind moved through the maple trees. For the first time since losing her, the pain inside him no longer felt like destruction. It felt like love that had simply changed shape. And perhaps that is what life truly does to us all eventually. It breaks our hearts open until we finally understand that even after terrible loss, there are still unexpected doors waiting quietly in the dark, hoping we will find the courage to open them. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.